Hello, it is spring of 2023, spring quarter of 2023, and this is History 72B. This lecture will wrap up Package G and will also take us back to some of the theory that we saw in the beginning of the quarter, as well as finishing up sets in the early Cold War. People often confuse the nature-nurture debate with the social construction essentialist debate. They are not the same. If you think back to the very first time I introduced social construction theory, I said it takes time to really understand. I also said that both biological and cultural explanations for a particular human trait could be essentialist. I'm going to explain that again now that you've had a chance to see examples of social construction theory used throughout this course. Then we'll look at the Kinsey reports and why the homosexual-heterosexual binary was not a particularly useful way of dividing up the variation in human sexual behavior among Americans, even the white middle class, in the mid-20th century. The rigid sexuality binary did work well for disempowering entire groups of people, which might mean that it worked well for those who benefited from hegemonic constructions, although not so much for those disempowered by those constructions. Finally, I'll go over the creation of a split in definitions between sex and gender, and how an idea of gender that was essentialist but posited a social origin, in other words, nurture, for individual gender played out in the mid-20th century. Starting off with nature and nurture. This is what you need to remember. Nature and nurture are both essentialist views. The nature versus nurture debate is not the same thing as the social construction theory versus essentialist debate. Nurture and social construction theory are not the same thing. The next set of slides explains why cultural essentialism and social construction theory are not the same. We are looking at the definition or the purpose of these two approaches. First, social construction theory is used to explain why a society focuses on a certain variable trait, for example, sexual object choice based on the sex of the desire. Essentialism starts with the assumption that a particular variable trait is universally important, then assumes that the subcategories formed by one society for the variable trait are universal, for example, homosexual, heterosexual, and then seeks to explain why an individual fits into a certain subcategory, for example, homosexual. Questions asked using social constructionist versus essentialist theory. Social construction theory asks questions like, why does Western society sort people by sexual object choice based on the sex of the desire? Why sexual object choice at all as a foundation of society? Why not sexual object choice based on some other potential category of attraction, like facial shape? Essentialism asks questions like, why is this individual homosexual? What causes homosexuality? When it comes to answers, social construction theory explains the way that society divides up human variation and how they link these to structures of power. In other words, what we have been doing all quarter long. Essentialism tries to explain the underlying cause of a certain description of a variable trait among humans. It may use either method or usually a combination of both biological nature and cultural nurture. The problems and drawbacks of social construction theory is that it's difficult, it's time-consuming, and most of all, it requires us to rethink our own categories of power. Essentialism, the drawbacks are, if the original assumption that the category, for example, homosexuality, adequately describes human variability is incorrect, then any research results are essentially meaningless. If you cannot consistently define your subcategories, those subcategories are not particularly useful. If the original assumption that all societies see and sort human variability in the same way is incorrect, then any research based on these assumptions is flawed. Social construction theory has the benefit that it helps us to understand how power structures work and potentially to change them. Essentialism is less complex, and if the subcategories do accurately reflect reality, then essentialist approaches can be informative. For instance, cystic fibrosis. Social construction theory does not equal nurture. Yes, I'm repeating that because it seems to be a hang-up for many people. Nurture and nature are both essentialist explanations for the form of a variable trait. Essentialist explanations are only good if the subcategories are mutually exclusive and well-defined. The category homosexuality is not well-defined, and it changes historically. This is not because people haven't figured out the true definition of homosexuality. It is that the category itself is flawed. Consider, let's say that homosexuality is desiring a sexual partner of the same sex. Seems simple, right? A man who is attracted to men is homosexual. But what counts as attraction? If a man says he is attracted to men but has never had sexual intercourse with a man, does he count? How do you classify a man who is attracted to women but will have sex with another man sometimes? That's not quite the same thing as desiring both sexes, but let's say that person is bisexual. If someone is bisexual, if they have sex with a person of one sex at one stage of their lives and a person of another sex at a later stage, what do we call that? Are they homosexual but in denial? Or are they homosexual and have finally realized it? Or might they have undergone a genuine shift that some people experience and others do not? What if a man has intercourse with someone intersex or non-binary? We can bring in pansexual, but what if someone's attraction is not based on the sex of the partner at all, but on something else entirely? Pansexual again, maybe? What if someone doesn't really want to have sex, but feels pressured by society to do so? Is their sexuality then determined by the sex of their partner? That's not really reflecting what's going on. If we want to design an experiment to explain why an individual is homosexual, we need a consistent and reliable definition for homosexual, and there is not one, because the subcategory homosexual is applied to a number of different sex lives and desires, most of which probably take shape differently in different people. Keep that in mind as we go to the mid-20th century and look at the Kinsey reports. I'm not going to go into Kinsey himself. You can Google information on him, not all of it trustworthy. And there is a movie, not all of it trustworthy, based on his life. What you need to know here is that Kinsey did extensive studies through interviews and surveys to see how Americans actually described their sexuality when they could respond anonymously as part of a sample of thousands. And Kinsey had 5,000 to 6,000 each for men and for women. Kinsey published his results in 2 books. Sexual Behavior in the Human Male came out in 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female was first published in 1953. The writing in these books was intended for a barely post-World War II scholarly audience, and it was quite dry. Nevertheless, the appeal of both books spread well outside of the scientific community. Each book was a popular bestseller when it came out. The Kinsey reports only looked at white middle-class subjects, but the white middle-class attitudes towards sex were the hegemonic ones, only heterosexuality and sex only in marriage, and then having a perfect nuclear family. That is what this group said they valued and what they said they were doing when asked in public. It is not what they were doing in private. Kinsey reported on, among other things, levels of premarital and extramarital sex among both men and women. These rates were far higher than most middle-class Americans assumed. Kinsey also reported on same-sex behavior. Early in the Kinsey group's interviews, they realized that not only did sexual behavior not fit with hegemonic ideals, it also was far more complex than a heterosexual, homosexual binary. Even adding the intermediate third category, bisexual, did not reflect actual human desires and behaviors. For example, the Kinsey team found that not just sexual behavior, but thoughts, feelings, and desires for the same or opposite sex could change across time. Kinsey came up with the appropriately named Kinsey scale. People at 0 reported exclusively heterosexual opposite sex behavior or attraction. Those at 6 reported exclusively homosexual same-sex behavior or attraction. Ratings 1 to 5 were for those who reported varying levels of attraction or sexual activity with either sex. In the original Kinsey report studies, the X category designated a group who reported no sociosexual contacts or reactions in their interviews. Kinsey's results included information such as 37, that's over a third, of white middle-class American males said they had at least some overt homosexual experience to orgasm. In Kinsey's initial results, 10% of males were classified as more or less exclusively homosexual. 8% of males were exclusively homosexual for 3 or more years between the ages of 16 and 55. Kinsey's results demonstrated enough range in human behavior that he concluded, quote, "The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects." He also noted that, again, quote, "Many persons do not want to believe that there are gradations in these matters from one to the other extreme." I'm not presenting the Kinsey scale because it is definitive. I'm presenting it to you because it broke through the assumption that all people were either homosexual or heterosexual, or maybe bisexual if we must split the difference. Remember, the Kinsey reports came out in 1948 and 1953, not in the 1970s. The idea that human sexuality could not accurately be described by discrete subcategories based on the sex of the desired partner followed the construction of the homosexual heterosexual binary for legal, medical, and political purposes pretty much right away. As of 2019, there were over 200 different scales to measure and describe sexual orientation. You are looking at the Klein sexual orientation grid on the left and the Storms sexuality scale on the right. Note that these scales will only work if both the subject and the object of sexual interest are clearly cis men or cis women. This does not take into account any of the variations that we know exist in sex. Individuals who are currently grouped into subcategories such as intersexual or trans, each of which includes a great deal of diversity on its own. This is why the essentialist questions, what causes homosexuality, or is there a gene for homosexuality, are not particularly useful. Which people do you categorize in the group homosexual? And once you've done that, how do you understand everyone else? Plus, if different researchers define homosexuality differently, but only report on the causes of homosexuality, that material cannot be compared in any meaningful way. The category homosexual has very, very real social consequences. If you look at 20th century research and activism, you will see arguments for so-called true homosexuality being innate and for homosexuality representing a choice. And you will see both of those explanations used at different times by both homophobes and gay activists, each for historically specific reasons. But the hard binary, innate versus choice, is, like all artificial binaries, going to include some people and totally exclude others who don't fit. And of course, all of that rests on the idea that sex itself is a discrete binary. If sexuality depends on the sex of the chooser and the sex of the desired, and those cannot be consistently defined, then the whole classification system is problematic. By the mid-1960s, scientists knew that any embryo could actually develop into male, female, or intersex because of changes in developmental processes. Doctors decided that the gonads, the testes or ovaries, rather than external form, were the definitive sign of sex. except that doctors could not always tell which type of gonads a person had, as it did not always correspond to external genital appearance. And assessing internal gonad from the outside is not particularly easy or pleasant, as you know if you did the Victorian hermaphrodite reading from an earlier lecture. Researchers discovered sex hormones and thought that they had found the definitive way to determine true sex. Then they learned that all sex hormones exist in all individuals, just in varying ratios, and those ratios change over the course of a lifetime. Plus, the so-called normal ratios are not well worked out, which you may know if you follow the news on elite track and field athletes who are excluded from competitions because, although considered women by anatomical inspection and their own sense of self, their testosterone levels, their natural testosterone levels, mind you, are outside of the supposedly normal range for females. There is zero reliable research on the actual variability in testosterone levels in people identified as anatomically female over space or time. By 1917, researchers had discovered the sex chromosomes X and Y, but those did not always sort correctly with a visual assessment of sex. There was no reliable combination of the range of variation within and the combinations between development, external anatomy, gonads, hormone levels, and sex chromosomes to support a strict binary. This meant that there simply was no definitive test for sex. Those of you who examined the Fausto Sterling articles know that although scientists had, against their own wishes, discovered that human bodies do not sort neatly into a male-female binary by 1920, Fausto Sterling was still having to demonstrate and explain this point in the 1990s. These images all show the development of male and female genitals from a common embryological form. The ones in the middle and on the upper left focus on morphology, and the two on the lower sides show pathways. This is the point that Fausto Sterling was trying to get across in both of her articles. Variability in what we call sex can form through a variety of pathways. It is tempting to ask whether this, the current view in the middle, supports the one-sex or the two-sex model from earlier lectures. I would actually say that this suggests that neither model is that useful, except for understanding historical developments. Doctors in the mid-20th century used the malleability of different physical aspects of sex to argue that intersex babies should be definitively assigned to one sex or the other, male or female. The child would then be modified physically through surgery and hormones and raised as either male or female as culturally defined. Corrective surgery, so-called corrective surgery, in the mid-1960s existed in the historical context of atomic era hegemonic American gender roles that assumed that men and women dressed, spoke, and acted in predictably different ways. We have seen again and again in this course the denial, punishment, and correction of bodies that gave lie to a clear, discrete male-female separation. From medieval death sentences and legal systems that only worked if an individual could be classed as either male or female, to Victorian doctors conducting invasive and often painful examinations of ambiguous bodies, what we have been looking at is the insistence that physical bodies fit a socially constructed idea of a discrete male-female binary for sex gender, rather than adapting cultural ideas to physical reality. And the slide says, if you're listening and not watching, up to 1.7% of babies are born with sex characteristics that don't fit typical definitions of male and female. That makes being intersex as common as being a redhead. Psychologist John Money theorized that if the visible sex could be made satisfactorily male or female, And if parents then raised a child carefully in the matching gender of male or female, as measured by hegemonic mid-20th century white American standards, then the individual would grow up to be accepted in society and be just fine in whatever sex had been assigned to them, sex, gender. Both sex and gender, as defined by Money and his group, were malleable in all individuals. The answer to any ambiguity was to make the individual change to fit society, not to adapt the subcategories constructed by society and medicine to reflect actual human variation. This was an essentialist explanation for gender, but a sociocultural, not a biological one. You are looking at the books I was forced to read in elementary school, looking at them and thinking about gender roles in the 50s and 60s. Publication of Dick and Jane, or later Sally, Dick and Jane, stopped in 1965. Nevertheless, my elementary school used this series to teach reading right through the 1970s. I have absolutely no nostalgia for Sally, Dick and Jane. In addition to promoting gender essentialism, they were stultifyingly boring. And I got in trouble in first grade for not reading all of the volumes. I tried to skip past some of them because Look, Jane, Look, See, Dick got boring after a while. The image outlined in red on the lower left, if you look closely at it, is a spoof done by someone who survived the deadly boredom of a Dick and Jane childhood. It fits well with both last lecture and this one. The insistence on a physical binary that would support the social hierarchy did not disappear in the 1960s. The rationale just took on a form that made sense in its historical context. This is when a split in meaning was assigned to sex versus gender. Sex became the physical or biological aspect, and gender became the behavioral aspect. The sex-gender binary has since been used by feminists, but that is not where it originally came from. And I am arguing it is a heuristic binary that may well have outlived its usefulness to understanding gender, sex, sexuality. John Money, a 20th century psychologist who spent his career correcting intersex bodies, is the one who split sex from gender. According to John Money, someone would be either male or female, and it depended utterly on how they were raised. Money confused a socially constructed category, gender, divided into male and female as an important power vector in American society, with a trait being socially produced. In other words, nurture in the individual. Social constructionists posit that human variation can be all combinations of biologically and socially produced traits in individuals. That is not what social construction is about. Social construction is about how society is constructed, not primarily about how society constructs each individual. As you know from Fausto Sterling, many different types of intersex or sex-ambiguous children were treated by doctors who assigned each child a matching sex and gender through surgery and prescriptive gendered parenting, assuming that it would all be fine. And for some individuals, it was fine. For some, it was not. You are looking at the Reimer family, which will be more meaningful to you in just a moment. The most famous example of the failure of Money's assumptions, the one that clearly demonstrated that there was more to sex and gender than Money and his group realized, was David Reimer. David and his identical twin brother were born with penises, and they were assigned male and all seemed fine until a doctor diagnosed the children with a foreskin abnormality and decided to use an unconventional technique to remove the foreskin. David Reimer was first, and the foreskin removal went catastrophically wrong. The infant Reimer's penis was badly damaged. Unsurprisingly, the parents did not allow the doctor to try the surgery on David's twin brother. In 1967, when the children were 2, the parents sought help from Money's famous and well-respected group at Johns Hopkins. Money recommended surgical and hormonal treatments over the course of David Reimer's development, and for the parents to raise Reimer specifically as a girl, according to what Money decided were female traits. In the repeated visits over the years to Money's clinic for surgeries and hormone treatments, David Reimer, treated as a middle-class American white girl, and his twin brother became one of Money's most famous experiments. He published and talked about these children. Here were genetically identical twins raised in the same environment. If one raised as a girl developed and socialized well, meaning made a heterosexual marriage to a man, then Money's theories would enjoy even greater success than they already did. Money had a lot riding on this. He did not just objectively observe the children growing up. In sessions with the children from preschool through grade school, Money basically dictated to them how they should behave, specifically how to behave differently to one another. Money declared Reimer's transition a success to the world, but for David Reimer, it was not a success. When he was actually permitted to speak for himself, he said that he had always felt gender dysphoria. Reimer did not identify as a girl. In his teens, he resisted being taken to Money's clinic. When Reimer was 15, his father finally told him about his birth and the subsequent procedures. Reimer assumed a male identity and took the name David. He had to undergo more surgeries and hormone treatments to bring his body more into alignment with his male sense of self. Money's group was still practicing corrective interventions on intersex children. David Reimer gave interviews, including to Oprah Winfrey, you see that on the left, and to Rolling Stone magazine, that's the one on the right, explaining his actual experiences and countering Money's narrative. David Reimer killed himself at the age of 38. Gender, whether defined separately from or along with sex, is best understood as a social construction. We have looked at how gender constructions have varied over time and space in different historical contexts. Not every society has been organized by gender, but this does not mean that societies that do use gender to sort power, it is somehow not real. Male and female are very real, very consequential subcategories of gender in the 1960s and 1970s. You are looking at ads from the 1970s. These are the ads that I saw as a child. In the 1970s, my siblings and I were not allowed to wear trousers to our public schools. We could only wear skirts. My mother had no legal choice but to take my father's name, a residue of coverture law. What you are looking at in these ads is not the result of anything natural. It has everything to do with distribution of power and the rationalizing of hierarchies. What I was exposed to as a child reflected the social construction of gender as a category meaningful in the mid-20th century. And if you are listening to this, I recommend looking at these ads. They are rather horrifying. Reimer's case shows us that the social construction of meaningful, very real in context categories and values of power is absolutely not the same thing as a trait produced in an individual purely by social or cultural training. A nurture explanation for the form a trait takes in an individual is not the same thing as a social construction of how the variability in that trait is used to divide groups in a society. The social expectations and the pressure that David Reimer and his brother faced to behave differently to one another based on assumptions about gendered behavior were socially constructed. David Reimer's actual sense of his own gender and sex was not produced by culture or upbringing. Key points for Lecture 22 in Package G. Nurture and social construction theory are not the same thing. Nurture describes how an individual forms a certain culturally meaningful trait. Social construction theory examines why this trait is meaningful in a particular society at a particular time. The subcategory homosexual and the category sexuality are both very real to us and also socially constructed. Any set of socially constructed subcategories that describe a set of traits that cannot be consistently defined in a reproducible way is difficult to examine scientifically. Homosexuality does not have a consistent definition. There is more variability in human sexuality than the categories of sexuality currently in use include or describe. So notice when I say that these things are socially constructed, I'm not saying that there is no difference in people. I'm saying that there are lots and lots of differences in people, and that there are lots of people who don't fit the categories that we make. In the mid-20th century, Kinsey's studies of American sexuality showed that the descriptors homosexual and heterosexual are, and were in the 1950s, inadequate to describe the actual lifetime desires and activities of people. Fausto Sterling and other researchers have demonstrated the complexity and variability that occurs naturally in the category of physical sex. In the mid-20th century, psychologist John Money proposed separating sex as a physical characteristic from gender, a set of social behaviors. This distinction was later picked up by second-wave feminists, but it originated in Money's experiments. Money proposed that both sex and gender were malleable and could be changed in an infant, sex through medical intervention, and gender by the way parents raised a child. His disastrous experiments on David Reimer did not support his hypothesis, and instead showed that at least some individuals have a strong sense of their sex, independent of the shape of their bodies. You are looking at a set of ads that pretty much epitomizes the hegemonic idea of summer vacation from my childhood. Your mission is to pick out all the socially constructed ideas, categories, and subcategories that you see reinforced in these ads.